Mr. Majewski's Anatomy 32 class lecture. Chapter 26, Reproductive System, Part 2, Female Reproductive System. So, the female reproductive system has a number of components, each with their own important functions. There is the ovaries up here that produces the secondary oocytes or egg cells and also produces hormones like estrogen and progesterone. There's the uterine tube, which transports the secondary oocyte to the uterus. This is also the site often of fertilization of the egg. You have the uterus, which is a site of the implantation of the fertilized ovum into the wall of the uterus and eventual development of a fetus and the initiation of labor or birth. You have the vagina, which is both a site that receives the penis and therefore semen, and is also a passageway for childbirth. And then, of course, mammillary glands, which are important for synthesizing, secreting, and ejecting milk for the newborn. So, ovaries. Ovaries are the female gonads held in the pelvic cavity. They are connected in place by three ligaments. They have the broad ligament, which is more of a sheet back here. It is a fold of the peritoneum. There is the ovarian ligament, which attaches the ovary to the uterus, and then the suspensory ligament, which attaches the ovary to the posterior side of the pelvic wall. Taking a closer look of the ovary, you see it has a number of components. It always possesses the germinal epithelium, which is this outermost layer of epithelial cells. Below that, or deep to that, is the tunica albuginea, which is composed of connective tissue. And then deep to that is the ovarian cortex, which is all this area here, where all this interesting stuff is happening. It is dense connective tissue, and it contains these ovarian follicles and also stromal cells. It's worth noting that most of these structures are only present at certain times. Only the primordial follicles and the little scars here are present all the time. Then you have the ovarian medulla, which is in the center, and it is more loosely arranged connective tissue. It also has blood vessels, nerve cells, lymph ducts, the things to keep the ovary alive. And then, of course, there's the hilum, which is where the blood vessels, nerves, lymph ducts enter and leave the ovary. Now let's take a look at these follicles. As I said before, the primordial follicle, an adult woman should have hundreds of these present. At certain times, a primordial follicle will develop into a primary follicle, which will then become a secondary follicle, which will then become a mature follicle or Graafian follicle. This will then, over time, break down into a corpus luteum, and then finally the corpus albicans, which is scar tissue or fiber that is present pretty much all the life of the ovary. But all these primary follicles down to the corpus luteum are only present at certain times. Oogenesis, the most important function of the ovary, is to produce a egg cell that can then be fertilized. So when you look at the primordial follicles, you see that you have what's called a primary oocyte, which is basically a cell that's ready to go through meiosis, but hasn't yet. It is still at the 2N stage. It has 46 chromosomes. And this is surrounded by follicular cells, which helps to take care of the primary oocyte. These develop during fetal development, start off with thousands. They start to degrade down to hundreds by the time the woman is adult. Then during puberty, starting in puberty and of course for decades afterwards, individual primary follicles will become primordial follicles will become primary follicles. Now it's basically gotten larger. It develops the granulosa cells and the fecula folliculi, which are surrounding the primary oocyte and stimulating it to begin meiosis. As the follicle gets bigger and becomes a secondary oocyte, it will now end up having a liquid-filled antrum. You have the continued division of both the theca folliculi and the granulosa cells. The granulosa cells are secreting the fluids that are in the antrum, while the theca folliculi will now expand into two layers, external and an interna. Still, the oocyte has not engaged in any meiosis yet. Then you get the mature follicle. You have a very large antrum filled with follicular fluid, and so forth. Looks pretty close to the same, except for that bigger fluid-filled area. And at this point, the primary oocyte will go through the first stage of meiosis and will divide into two cells, each containing 23 chromosomes. One is the secondary oocyte, the other is what's called a polar body. The polar body has very little of the cytoplasm and degrades. So then the mature follicle will rupture during ovulation, releasing the secondary oocyte surrounded by the corona radiata, which is basically just cells taking care of the oocyte. And this secondary oocyte will be swept into the peritoneal cavity and then enter the uterine tube. From here, in the uterine tube, usually the secondary oocyte will potentially unite with a sperm. It is only now at this post-ovulation point in which the secondary oocyte is fixing to get fertilized that you have the second cell division occur, causing you to have the final oocyte that will then fuse with the sperm cell and another polar body that is just lacking in most of the cytoplasm and ends up degrading. So, kind of confusing, but basically what happens is during the fetal period you get the primordial follicles, you get the primary oocytes that are ready to go into meiosis. During puberty and for decades afterwards, you'll have a primordial follicle develop. And here again, you still have that primary oocyte. It isn't until you get to the mature follicle stage that you have the first cell division leading to a secondary oocyte. Ovulation occurs, and then it isn't during, except at the fertilization point, that you get the second cell division of meiosis, and then finally the production of a zygote. So we got this process occurring. The secondary oocyte gets swept into the uterine tube, which will then transport it down into the uterus. The uterine tube has three main parts. It has the infundibulum, which is this sort of funnel-shaped structure that has these little fringe-like, finger-like projections called fimbriae, and they are sort of have cilia. They're trying to cause a current to pull the oocyte into the uterine tube. You have the ampulla of the uterine tube, which is a bit wider, and then that goes into the isthmus of the uterine tube, which is thinner, then depositing the oocyte into the uterus. This process usually takes about 6 to 7 days for the secondary oocyte to move all the way through the uterine tube, and again, this is also where fertilization usually occurs. Parts of the uterus. The uterus is this big structure. It has a fundus, which is the top superior portion, and then a tapering body that ends in the isthmus, which is a constricted area. And it's in the body that you have the uterine cavity. And then finally, at the very end of the uterus is the cervix, which is an inferior, very narrow portion that then opens into the vagina. The cervix has its own cervical canal with an internal os leading into the uterine cavity and an external os leading into the vagina. There are a number of ligaments that hold the uterus in place. You have the broad ligament, which we've talked about already, which is part of the peritoneum, which is attached to the uterus on either side and attaches to either side of the pelvic cavity. You have the uterosacral ligaments that connect the uterus to the sacrum, the cardinal ligaments that extend to the pelvic wall, and then the round ligaments that extend from the uterus to the labia majora of the external genitalia, sort of keep everything lined up properly. Some disorders of the uterus can include, and ovaries include ovarian cysts, which are fluid-filled sacs. These are often not cancerous, but they can cause pain and bleeding. And then you could have uterine prolapse. If the connective tissue isn't holding, ligaments isn't holding the uterus in place properly, it could move into the vagina and even completely out of the woman's body. So when you look at the uterus, you see that it has three main layers. It has an outermost layer called the perimetrium, which is continuous with the peritoneum and eventually becomes the broad ligament. You have the second layer, which is the myometrium. That's where the three layers of smooth muscles are in the uterus, and these are what contract during labor. And then finally, you have the innermost layer called the endometrium, and the endometrium actually is composed of two layers: the stratum functionalis, which lines the uterine cavity and sloughs off during menstruation, and then deep to that, the stratum basilis, which is the permanent layer that then regenerates a new stratum functionalis during the whole uterine cycle. So, if we look at these layers, we see that you have the outermost perimetrium, then you have the three layers of smooth muscle in the myometrium, and then the endometrium's layers, the stratum basilis and the stratum functionalis. And this is early on, and then near the end of menstrual cycle. More accurate way to portray that would be this, because these layers don't change in size. It is just the stratum functionalis that gets larger during the menstrual cycle. So blood is very important to nourish the fetus, and so it's important to know that you have a uterine artery that arrives to the uterus. It will then start to branch off in the arcuate artery that's going around the length of the uterus. That will then branch off into the radial arteries that are going into the tissue of the uterus. That then become the straight arterioles found in the stratum basilis and the spiral arterioles, which are found in the stratum functionalis. Disorders. Well, there's cervical cancer. This is cancer of the cervix. It causes a strange shape in the cervical structure itself. This can be detected in the early stages by a pap smear. Then you have the vagina. The vagina is a tubular structure of fibromuscular canal. It has little rugae in it, little folds that are caused by the mucosa layer of the vagina. It has a fornix, which is sort of the area that wraps around the cervix that's protruding into the vagina. And then at the most exterior end of the vagina, you often have the hymen, which is a thin fold of the mucosa layer that's partially going around the vaginal orifice. Externally, you've got the vulva, which is the external genitalia of the female. Some of the larger structures include the mons pubis, which is an elevation right before the external genitalia that is composed of adipose tissue. You have the two folds of skin in the vulva, the outer one being the labia majora and the inner one being the labia minora. Labia minora has no pubic hair and little fat. You have the prepuce of the clitoris, which is the point where the labia minora unite and cover over the body of the clitoris. And the clitoris itself is a small cylindrical mass of erectile tissue. You have the vestibule, which is this whole little area that includes the external urethra and the vaginal opening. And then you have the bulb of the vestibule, which is more erectile tissue that's sort of deep to the labia minora and is on either side of the vaginal orifice. And that's it for the female reproductive system.